Yeah, I mean, this is
Yeah.
it becomes even an even more vital ally in that case, and Turkish control of the Dardanelles, of the Straits, becomes still more important, because if the Black Sea becomes a Russian lake in the same way that the Caspian Sea is a Russian lake, it is already becoming a Russian lake, by the way. I mean, the Russians already have military dominance over the Black Sea. We can see that now. But if the Black Sea becomes an uncontested Russian lake, then it becomes even more important that you have the Turks preventing the Russians from being able to send their fleet unrestricted into the Eastern Mediterranean. A Turkey that aligns with Russia opens the Dardanelles to Russian warships, changes the entire military balance potentially in the Eastern Mediterranean, because the Russians can then build up their Black Sea fleet, send their forces through the Dardanelles into the Eastern Mediterranean, challenge the US Sixth Fleet there, and potentially, because they have the advantage of proximity, extend their influence all the way to Italy, to the central Mediterranean, to the Italian coast. Turkey, in NATO, an ally of the United States, prevents that happening.
Yeah. For years, the Black Sea has been treated as a regional theater of the Russia-Ukraine war. But that picture is becoming harder to maintain. Russia has intensified strikes around Odesa and Ukraine's southern export infrastructure, while commercial shipping has become increasingly cautious about entering the region. And Turkey, the NATO member that controls the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, is suddenly sitting at the center of the problem. The question is not simply whether Russia can pressure Odesa. The bigger question is what happens if Russia permanently changes the balance of power around the Black Sea, and what that would mean for Turkey, NATO, and ultimately the United States. The interview you're about to hear makes a much bigger argument than the battlefield headlines suggest. But first, we need to understand what is happening around Odesa right now.
I would just add to that there's now also, just shortly before we started making this program, reports that are saying that they're coming after the big energy infrastructure in the area of Odesa as well, and not just energy storage infrastructure, but also energy generation infrastructure. These are massive attacks. It has been going on every single night now, and every single day, quite often, for weeks. We also see Russian aviation, aircraft, bombers, in other words, starting to drop bombs on harbor installations and other installations. Odesa and the greater Odesa area and the whole port infrastructure is being pounded. And we've talked many times about a sea blockade, but it now looks like a land blockade is being implemented around Odesa as well. Now, I am, as you know well, not a military person.
Well, I forgot to say real quick that there's no air defense, by the way.
There's no air defense.
I think everyone knows this already.
Absolutely.
No
Everybody can see this. Now, as I said, I'm not a military person. We're not military people. We're not here to try and calculate. We're not, authoritative in terms of military assessments. But I have to say that, to me, all of this looks increasingly like not just an operation to close the Black Sea ports and to blockade Ukraine, which it has done extremely effectively. Apparently, no ships have passed through Odesa, been able to exit Odesa since the 22nd of July. That's what the Ukrainians themselves are saying, with catastrophic effects on the Ukrainian economy. And it's also starting to look as if the Russians are preparing the ground for some kind of operation to seize Odesa itself. I mean, I have to say this, because if you're starting to cut off the land corridors, the energy generation and energy storage facilities and all of those things, it looks like an operation to capture Odesa, perhaps by sea, and the Russians have a significant sea lift capacity in the Black Sea, the extent of which has been underestimated by the West, which has been peddling this fantasy about the Russian fleet in the Black Sea having been destroyed. And of course, no doubt, if that is indeed going to happen, it is presumably going to happen in conjunction with some kind of Russian advance across the Dnieper as well, from Kherson region, and perhaps also from Zaporozhye region, where the Russians are also making big advances. There are reports that there is now actually fighting going on inside the key fortified town of Orechov in Zaporozhye region. Orechov, the last major place that the Ukrainians control in Zaporozhye region, apart from the city of Zaporozhye itself. So perhaps that is taking us too far forward, but I have to say that this massive, sustained aerial offensive we've never had from the Russians throughout the period of this war, an aerial offensive of this kind conducted against one specific location. This massive aerial offensive does look to me like it is a preparation for some kind of operation against Odessa, maybe not tomorrow or in a week's time, but maybe at some point, say later in the winter after the rains, when the weather starts to stabilize again, and you start to get a situation where you can start to contemplate an operation of this kind. Just say.
What makes this significant is the distinction between an attack on infrastructure and a deliberate attempt to change the strategic environment around a port. The first part is observable. Odessa and surrounding infrastructure have been repeatedly targeted, and commercial shipping has become increasingly cautious. The second part is interpretation. The guest is arguing that the pattern could be preparation for a larger operation against Odessa. That is not something we should present as established fact. There is a major difference between saying Russia is applying pressure around Odessa and saying Moscow has decided to capture the city. But there is an important reason to take the possibility seriously. Odessa is not just another Ukrainian city. It is part of the country's maritime lifeline. And the latest reporting shows that the pressure is already affecting alternative export routes. So the real story may not be whether one particular attack signals an invasion of Odessa. It may be whether Russia can make Ukraine's access to the Black Sea increasingly difficult without ever needing to launch that operation. And that brings Turkey into the center of the story.
We're closer to an outright clash. I don't mean a military clash, but a political and geopolitical confrontation between Russia and Turkey than we have ever been. Now, this has been a very strange relationship. It's widely known that Putin and Erdogan, at a personal level, have tensions with each other. There are lots of people in Russia, especially, who've never had much belief in this relationship and believe again that Putin has overinvested in it. Erdogan, as we know, went completely against Russian policy in Syria and orchestrated the fall of Assad there. He's played a very complex game, which is ultimately an anti-Russian game in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. But nonetheless, and in spite of all of that, the Russians have held things together with Erdogan. They continue to build a nuclear power station in Turkey. There's talk about building another nuclear power station in Turkey. They supply Turkey with energy on a big scale via Turk Stream. They also invest heavily in the Turkish economy. And of course, large numbers, millions in fact, of Russian tourists come to Turkey, where at some level, which I don't fully understand, they're apparently able to use their Mercouris. So this has been a fairly close relationship. But we are now approaching the point where if our analysis about Odessa is correct, this is going to start, Russian actions are going to start to infringe Turkish interests. Because for Erdogan and for Turkey, the absolute nightmare, the strategic nightmare, is the Russians gaining control of Odesa and Ukraine's Black Sea ports. In other words, gaining control of the entire northern coastline of the Black Sea. They already control Crimea. If that happens, then Russia is reestablished conclusively as the major decisive power in the Black Sea. Turkey has a lot of economic interests in the Black Sea. It will be very, very alarming for the Turks and for Erdogan if that happened. It would mean that the power balance between Russia and Turkey would have shifted decisively and indeed overwhelmingly in Russia's favor. And the Turks, Erdogan, will not like that. And they're now trying to put spokes in the wheel of this process. So they're now demanding a ceasefire in the Black Sea. They want the Russians and the Ukrainians to stop attacking each other's ships. Well, again, like all proposals for ceasefires, given that it is Ukraine that is being hammered, that would obviously favor massively Ukraine. It would mean, in effect, the reopening of Ukraine's Black Sea ports and the resumption of the grain and export trades through the Black Sea, which obviously would be an economic lifeline to the Zelensky government. And I think beyond that, if there is going to be a Russian military operation over the next few months to capture Odesa, which I have to say over the last 2 or 3 days, I've started to think is becoming likely, then the Turks are not going to be happy and they're going to try to oppose it. And in the meantime, they've taken the first steps to try to close the Dardanelles, the Turkish Straits, to shipping, heading to Novorossiysk to collect oil and other goods from there. And to be absolutely clear about that, that is an anti-Russian move.
Outside of closing the Dardanelles, what else could Turkey do?
Well, they can do one very important thing, which they have
Russia
not
can
done.
do a lot.
Russia can do a huge amount, but they can. The Turks can also do something else, which they haven't done since February 2022, which is open the Dardanelles for the passage of Western warships to enter the Black Sea. Now, that, of course, would set up a potential situation for a clash between the Russians and NATO.
This is where the story becomes much more complicated than the interview's strongest predictions. Turkey is not simply preparing to confront Russia. In fact, Ankara's public position has been much more cautious. Turkey has repeatedly called for maritime safety and de-escalation while maintaining working relationships with both Moscow and Kyiv. On August 4th, Turkish officials called on Russia and Ukraine to protect navigation after a Turkish-owned vessel was hit near Novorossiysk and 3 crew members were seriously injured. And on August 9th, Turkish officials said passage through the Turkish Straits was continuing normally, despite reports of restrictions. That matters because the interview raises a much more dramatic possibility: NATO warships entering the Black Sea. But Turkey's control of the Straits is governed by the Montreux Convention, and the rules are not simply a switch that Ankara can flip whenever it wants. Turkey has been applying restrictions on warship passage since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So the immediate reality is not that Turkey and Russia are heading inevitably toward war. The reality is more interesting. Turkey is trying to preserve room to maneuver while the strategic value of that room is increasing. And if Russia continues to strengthen its position around Odesa and the wider Black Sea, Ankara may eventually have to choose which interests it values most: its relationship with Moscow, its position inside NATO, or its own ambition to remain the indispensable power controlling access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. That is where the consequences become much bigger.
Of course, if you are Erdogan and you run a neo-Ottoman foreign policy and you want to position Turkey as a rising great power and one day as a superpower, something which, to be absolutely clear, is far beyond Turkey's current strength, well, then, of course, it is a disaster because realistically, if the Russians are in control of the Black Sea, which they would be, I mean, they'd be, again, the dominant military power in the Black Sea, then your ideas of establishing Turkey in that way as, you know, the neo-Ottoman superpower are going to turn to dust. But is it actually in Turkey's long-term interests to try to pursue that kind of objective? Isn't it already beyond Turkey's reach to do that? Isn't it involving Turkey in all kinds of problems in all sorts of places? Syria, where, again, there's been more reports that Giuliani just survived a coup attempt and that the situation for Turkey there is very brittle. Isn't it far better for Turkey to have a stable partner on the northern coast of the Black Sea than to have weak countries along the Black Sea with the Americans and NATO playing all sorts of complex games there, which result in a war? What ultimately does Turkey lose if the Russians gain control of Odessa? It's, again, a geopolitical fantasy, but it's one I think that Erdogan himself believes in and which some members of his inner circle do. The wider Turkish public, I don't think they care. From their point of view, the relationship with Russia has worked well. At the nuclear power stations, the people who run the hotels in Antalya and indeed on the Black Sea are very happy to get the Russian tourists. The small business people who have various dealings selling agricultural products and some industrial products and consumer goods to Russia, they do very well too. The people who run the big construction companies that have had business in Russia, they also do perfectly well. Why should they care if the Russians ultimately get to Odessa? It's not as if the Russians any longer have plans, as they did in the 19th century, or at least some Russians did in the 19th century, to advance all the way to Istanbul. I mean, this is not part of Russia's agenda anymore. So, objectively, practically, for Turkey, it makes absolutely no difference. It doesn't undermine their security one jot if this happens. But as I said, Erdogan is unlikely to think about this in quite these terms because he has, as I said, these alternative fantasies of Turkey becoming, again, this great power, one day, balance, potentially in the Eastern Mediterranean, because the Russians can then build up their Black Sea fleet, send their forces through the Dardanelles into the Eastern Mediterranean, challenge the US Sixth Fleet there, and potentially, because they have the advantage of proximity, extend their influence all the way to Italy, to the central Mediterranean, to the Italian coast. Turkey, in NATO, an ally of the United States, prevents that happening.
And that is where the story takes its most important turn. At first glance, a stronger Russian position in the Black Sea appears to be a straightforward strategic loss for Turkey and NATO. But there is another possibility. The more powerful Russia becomes in the Black Sea, the more strategically important Turkey's position could become to the United States and NATO, because Turkey controls the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. That does not make a confrontation inevitable. It makes Turkey's choices more consequential.